Look at this map of Viking settlements in the North Atlantic, and you'll notice one thing. They're all super hostile landscapes, even in comparison to Scandinavia. For example, settlements in Greenland sit just below the ice cap. They have the most dangerous land animals, polar bears. Iceland has a large inland desert and active volcanoes. The Faeroe Islands are made up of some rocky outcrops sticking up into the sea in some of the worst weather systems the North Sea has to offer. And the Vikings were doing this all over 1,000 years ago in ships made of wood, with no compasses, with no pre-established settlements to take over. They had to travel across vast oceans and then set themselves up before they starved or froze to death. So have you ever stopped to wonder, how the hell did they survive in these places? And why did they do it? Well, I was super intrigued by all this, so I set out to do a bit of digging. So, the year is 871, give or take, and the first settlers begin their journey to Iceland from Norway. They arrive and find a heavily wooded island with glaciers, mountains, and volcanoes. This was what the saga writers would term landnam, or the settlement period of Iceland. They arrived there in the summer months, but even summer in Iceland can be brutal, and the even more treacherous winter was coming. They would have to act fast to establish their settlements. But, more importantly, they needed to establish their food supplies, or they risked starving when winter eventually came. Now, I've been looking at many papers which detail the animal remains left behind in Iceland, and the results are really quite interesting. Now, because Iceland's a volcanic island, it means that we can use a dating method called tephrochronology. Tephrochronology basically relies on the volcanic ash that's spread all across the island, and using that we can be really specific with our dating. Now, when you come to dig up a soil sample, you can see clear lines of ash, and in between those you can see the archaeology. And this gives us a really clear picture of what's going on at what time in Iceland. Now, the papers I found show a really interesting trend in that first period, the landnam phase, or the settlement period, for archaeofaunal remains. Now, this basically just means the remains of animals found at archaeological sites, primarily used as a food source. In this first period of settlement, the Icelanders were eating a huge proportion of birds, 40% from the sources I found. When compared to later periods, this drops to only 3% of the numbers of identified species in the 10th century. It's 5% in the 11th century, and 6% in the 12th century. This data surely suggests that during the earliest phases of settlement, the Icelanders didn't have a reliable food source, and therefore had to resort to birds for subsistence. But that might not actually be the case. If we compare the Icelandic phases to what was happening in the Faroes, we see that birds made up 34% of the number of identified species at a 9th century site in the Faroes. However, the Faroe Islands has really poor soil quality, which makes it difficult for arable crops to feed domestic animals. Hence, they must have used birds as an alternative. And because the Faroes were settled earlier than Iceland, we might then suggest that Icelanders were adapting the economic practices of the Faroe Islanders. But once they realised they can make use of the fertile soil in Iceland, they dropped the practice of eating birds for their subsistence and turned to farming and fishing. This is a clear sign that the Vikings were willing to adapt to their environment in order to survive. But what about in Greenland? After all, Greenland is a much harsher climate. And why did they go there in the first place? So there's this guy, Erik the Red, and he gets in trouble in Iceland for killing a couple of men. So the Icelandic parliament exiles him for 3 years, and he decides he wants to go find some new land during this time. So in 982, based on a rumour of land, he sails west and he discovers Greenland. He sets up a small settlement there with his followers and he explores the land throughout his time in exile. In 985, Erik the Red's exile is finally over and he's free to return to Iceland, which he does so, but he's not planning on hanging around. In fact, he starts selling people on the idea of new land and new opportunities in this place that he called Greenland. And people are kind of hooked on this idea. They're like, yeah, I want a bit of that green land. I'm gonna come with you. And he manages to convince 25 shiploads of people to come along with him on his expedition. Of the 25 ships, only 14 successfully make the crossing to Greenland. Now, I always imagined that this was because Iceland was already too heavily populated and there wasn't enough land to go around. But no, actually the settlement of Iceland hadn't even finished by this point, so there must be an ulterior motive other than just land. And despite giving Greenland a luscious name, they need to be tempted by more than just land to go on a potentially perilous voyage into the unknown with an outlaw. So what convinced 25 shiploads of Icelanders that Greenland was worth risking their lives for? Well, after some digging in the sources, I found a thing called the Nordsetter. But before we get onto the Nordsetter, how are the Greenlanders surviving? The Greenlanders had a hugely different diet if we look at sites from both the eastern and western settlements. They made use primarily of what was around them, like in the later periods of Iceland. Most notably, this meant seals, and more crucially, caribou or reindeer. Notably, there is little to no evidence of fish and birds at the archaeological sites. Something that again makes Greenland so different. It also shows that the Vikings were quickly adapting to their surroundings and making use of the resources they had. Anyway, back to the Nordsetter. This was Erik the Red's Viking equivalent of a get-rich-quick scheme. Would you be on board? The Icelanders would come and settle Greenland in both the eastern and the western settlements. Then, every summer they would sail the 800-kilometre journey up the northern coast to a place called Disco Bay. No, not that disco, spelt with a K. It was here that they would hunt for valuable commodities such as walrus ivory. The ivory would then be extracted and worked into commodities that could be sold across the Viking world. Walrus ivory appears in every single one of the major trading ports in the Viking world, such as Sigtuna, Hedeby and Dublin. One of the most famous artefacts from the entire Viking Age is actually made of walrus ivory, the Lewis chessmen. Intricately carved pieces that were found on the Isle of Lewis. It clearly shows how wide this network of Viking trade actually went. So, the Icelanders were clearly tempted over to Greenland to participate in these hunts up north, in which they would no doubt profit hugely from the trade of these goods. But what about keeping warm? After all, the climates in the North Atlantic, as we've already discussed, can be less than ideal. But was that always the case? Well, if you look at this graph of Greenland ice sheet temperatures, from the years 1000 to the year 2000, we see something really quite interesting. So from the year 1000 to the year 1250, we see this consistently higher temperatures, and this happens to coincide exactly when the Vikings were settling Greenland. If we look a little bit further on from this medieval warm period, we notice that in the year 1500, the temperature plummets to a minus 1.75 degree average for the Greenland ice sheets. And this happens to be the exact same time when the Vikings left the settlement in Greenland. Everyone packed up shop and left, probably because it was too cold. So, knowing this, we can probably determine that the Vikings decided to settle Greenland in the first place due to the warmer temperatures that were around at the time. And when the temperature dropped too low, they decided to leave entirely. The temperature during the Viking Age was certainly higher, and no doubt that helped their survival. Even so, the climates of Iceland and Greenland would still be incredibly harsh, so let's explore some of the ways in which they would keep warm. Perhaps the most famous example of the Vikings keeping themselves warm would have been the use of insulation. Now, this wouldn't be insulation as we know it today, but the Vikings would have used turf blocks in the construction of their houses. And especially in places like the Faeroe Islands where the soil quality was really poor and trees wouldn't be readily available, turf would be a great alternative. Also, timber was really expensive because it would have to be imported into the Faroe Islands. Similarly, at the beginning of the Icelandic settlement, Iceland was covered in trees, but soon the trees disappeared and they also would have had to turn to things like turf for their construction. But it was also a great material because it kept everything warm. A little fun fact about woodland in Iceland, so when the Vikings got there it was really heavily wooded, but pigs became a huge problem, and this is detailed in the Gragas Law Code of 1120, which goes as follows. Pigs are not to be kept in communal pasture. They have no immunity from injury on any man's land except their owners, unless it is a home-field boar with a ring in its snout. Despite the Greenlanders using thick fur and wool for their clothing, perhaps one of the main reasons the settlement eventually failed was because the Greenlanders were more in tune with European mainland fashion at the time, which was not suited to the Arctic climate. When compared to the indigenous peoples who used caribou and sealskin for their clothing, it's no wonder the settlement of Greenland eventually failed. Clearly, the Vikings were able to survive these harsh North Atlantic islands, adapting their methods of survival depending on the place they went to. Whether it be making use of the limited resources in the Faroe Islands, or adapting similar practices to those in Scandinavia, in Iceland in the later periods. or taking advantage of the slightly warmer weather in Greenland to develop profitable trade routes. But what about you? What do you think? Which island would you have survived best on? Let me know down in the comments. Personally, I think despite the incredibly harsh weather and occasional volcanic eruption in Iceland, I think I probably would have survived best in Iceland, mainly because the land resources were a bit better and you could use those similar practices to Scandinavia. And hey, while you're here, why not check out this video next?